All right, summer classes 2019. We're on now to Chapter 9, Political Parties. So this will be the next to last of the set of chapters that we have for our second midterm exam, which will be 3 essay questions. And you have those essay questions already available to you to review. Chapter 9, Political Parties. This is at the very beginning of the text, and if you read through this segment, you can get a sense of how important political parties are to our system. Note that they're not officially part of the Constitution, but you can see here as you read through this segment, find it there in your text on page 334, that you get a sense that it's very important to maintain a democracy with the help of political parties. In the United States, we've made some reference to this before, that we really have a two-party system. I will bring up that there are 2 well-established third parties currently in our political system, but we have had 2 major political parties, and in fact the same 2 political parties now, going back to the 1850s. But as you'll see in your text in the segment titled Party Systems, that really from the beginning of the history of the United States, you've had a 2-party system. A lot of that is cultural, but it's also structural when you look at the way our elections are designed. This is a well-known political scientist from the 1950s and 60s, E. Schatzsnyder. And we can see here that he would say you just don't have a democracy, a modern democracy, a large-scale system. People cast votes, people participate on a national system, but also participate at the local and state levels as well. None of that is really possible as far as Schatzsnyder is concerned without having political parties. So what would be a political party? And this is from your text on page 337. Organized groups that attempt to influence the government by electing their members to important government offices. So the key of a political party is to elect people to office. So there's influence, there's shaping policies, there's trying to attract people to a cause, but above all else, it's to elect people to offices. And these are the 24 candidates for the Democratic nomination of president in the year 2020. As we mentioned before, when we talked about the chapter on the media, there will be 2 debates this summer in which there will be 10 people in each debate. And so that will be 20 of the candidates. Well, there's 24 listed here. So there were 4 candidates that did not make this list of 20, as we see here, to participate in those debates. But that's a large amount of people that in the past, that would have been whittled down at the convention or before the convention. And certainly we can imagine that by the time the primaries start in February of 2020, there won't be 24 candidates still on the ballot. Perhaps that number will be reduced by as much as half by that time. And currently then in our 2-party system, and we look at the branches of government, in particular the executive branch and legislative branch, we have divided government. We have one party in charge of the presidency, the executive branch, and the legislative branch is divided between the Democrats and Republicans. Do parties matter? It's a very fair question. And I've already tried to establish the argument that yes, they do matter, but it's fair to have some questions about that. But I'm always interested in looking at real life situations and applying that question, do parties matter? And so here in the country of Thailand, just think if you read this headline, and this was from USA Today, newspaper here in the United States, and this was a few years back. Thai military declares coup, detains party leaders. And a coup is a French term. The complete term is coup d'etat. It's an overthrow of the state. And so there was an overthrow of the government in Thailand, and the military took over. And in that process, military leaders were detained. Now, what I find interesting, party leaders were detained. What I find interesting about that is that if political parties really didn't matter, then why would you detain them? Why would you put them under house arrest or send them to jail? And so having opposing political parties to have one dictatorship or one form of leadership in charge, the political parties were viewed as a threat, a distraction. And so those opposing political parties were, at least the attempt was to put them out of business. And that happened with this dictatorship, a dictatorship by a political party, the National Socialist Party in Germany in 1930s, to be specific, as you can see here, the date, July 14th, 1933. On that date, this political party outlawed all other political parties. So you have a pretty strong sign that your country's heading towards a dictatorship when any organized group that opposes those in charge are now going to be arrested or detained. Then you can see what's happening to your country. So it does give us a sense of the importance of opposition parties in a democracy, and when there's not a democracy, what might happen. So I think we get some ideas that yes, indeed, political parties do matter. Here's ways in which political parties serve the system that we have here in the United States. And we'll go into some detail about each one of these. Recruit candidates, nominate candidates, mobilize voters, contest elections, provide accountability, and provide social services. Let's note on the last one there that political parties really don't do that today, that this has been something that's been phased out primarily by the 1930s. Most of this was gone, and certainly by the 1970s it really started to just completely end in the major cities of this country. So it's, I should say not used, excuse me for that, but that's what you should remember on that. We don't use the old machine or boss system anymore. So recruit candidates. Just consider if one party's been out of power for a while in a particular state or location, then that opposition party is going to try to find somebody to go run for office, ask people to run, and try to identify someone who has some talents and skills and abilities that would attract people. You can imagine that's pretty hard if you're in an area where one party consistently is winning. Then ask the party that consistently is losing to get someone to run. It's not going to be easy to do. And then to nominate candidates, we have different processes here to nominate candidates. And of course, as we have mentioned about the presidential election, that will be in November of 2020. But really starting in February of 2020, we'll see the formal process of nominating candidates. In that process, you'll have two main systems throughout the states to select delegates that will then go to the convention and formally nominate candidates of the two major political parties. And one system is called the caucus. This is actually used in Kansas, so one of the nearer states that uses this system. This is usually a system that has fewer people participating in it because, as you can see here, you have to show up at a set time and you have to announce publicly which candidate you will support. And more people are reluctant to actually go through that process. They may have time constraints, job demands that prevents them from really being able to do that. And then other people may just simply not want to have to express their vote publicly with everyone else. But that's the process for the caucus. Most states would use a primary, and the vote would be similar to the general election, although who can participate may be limited. If it's an open system, and even there's a variety of the open primary on how that's applied, but registered voters can participate and perhaps even cross over. So just like the name suggests, Republicans voting in the Democrat primary, Democrats voting in the Republican primary. There are plenty of states that don't necessarily go that direction with the open primary and instead would allow people who are registered independent, meaning they're not a member of a political party, and that they could then vote in a party's primary. States also have a closed primary, and that would mean that only those who are registered in that party can vote in the primary. So this just gives you an idea of some of the differences early on in the nomination process. And it can tell us that really this election coming up, so this is the last presidential election, that in large part by mid-March, and so roughly a 6-week period formally, there's a lot of informal activity going on before that, just like we're seeing right now. But in the formal process, in about a 6-week period, you're going to have a great idea of who will be the nominee. It will continue on after that, but a lot of delegates and a lot of votes will have been, a lot of delegates selected and a lot of votes cast by mid-March. Now there's some differences here with the political parties and a lot of language here on this screen. You might want to pause and look it over. But the Democrats used a proportional system to determine their delegates throughout the whole primary and caucus process. Republicans use the proportional system only in a limited sense. And so as a result of that, the more you use the winner-take-all, just like the name suggests, the more you can wrap up, or faster you can wrap up the election, because the person who consistently wins, unless there's several different winners in different states, the person who consistently wins is going to be able to then get more delegates than anybody else. But in the proportional system, you can continue to lose and still end up with delegates. So that's a difference there in the style of the two major political parties. And that was reflected in the process of selecting the candidate. Candidate Trump, as you can see there, got the nomination by May 3rd. It was a month later that candidate Clinton got the nomination for the Democrat Party by June the 8th. Now, it's worth noting, if you look at the total votes in the Democrat Party, Clinton got 57% of the vote, and Sanders, the major challenger in 2016, and a candidate again in 2020, got 43% of the vote. So she got more of the vote, but since it was proportional, he was able to continue to compete. And the case there for candidate Trump and why he was able to win, even though it still was drawn out somewhat, you had more of the states in the Republican Party that are winner take all. So if you win the state just by a few votes over anyone else, you get all the delegates. And let's recall that back in 2016, it was a very crowded field for the Republicans. So a winner take all, meaning that you don't need to perhaps get that much of the overall vote to get all the delegates. If you have more candidates running, it could mean that you have a candidate win with only 30 or 35% of the total vote in that case. And so that can be beneficial to the candidate who ends up winning. So, interesting combination that's going on in the state of Oklahoma, and we still have that for 2020. So it is a closed primary for Republicans. If you're wanting to vote, for example, in the Republican primary in 2020, and there is right now listed a challenger for President Trump. So you could see then you would have someone to vote for in the primary, but you will have to be a registered Republican if you want to go that route. If you want to vote in the Democrat primary, you don't have to be registered as a Democrat. You can be registered as an independent. So we don't have party crossover in the state of Oklahoma for the Democratic primary, meaning that you could be a registered Republican and vote in the Democrat primary, but you could be a registered independent. All right, so we've talked about recruiting candidates, nominating candidates. They also mobilize voters. And if you recall from Chapter 8, the most effective way to get people to participate, to vote, is face-to-face campaigning, door-to-door campaigning, so a personal contact. That's what matters. And so we can see here getting people active in a political party and getting them to participate by knocking on people's doors and asking them personally for that vote is the most effective way to get other people to go vote. So this is an important activity for the parties. And then also to contest elections. So there has to be at least 2 people on the ballot for that to be a legitimate election as far as democracy is concerned. So you must have more than 1 candidate on the ballot. So in dictatorships, you may hear from a dictator that that individual was reelected. Fidel Castro, when he was in charge of Cuba for many years, would have elections and he would win. But he was also the only one on the ballot. So you can't really say that's a contested election. And so it would not fit with democracy. Provide accountability, perhaps harder to do if you have divided government as we have right now. In this case, you get to pick and choose who to give credit to or who to blame. If things are going well, which of the 2 parties do you give the most credit to? If they're not going well, which one do you blame? And if you have one party clearly in charge, you can still come up with excuses to say that there's a reason why things aren't going well, or excuses to give credit to some other organization. But it's not as easy to do those things if one party is clearly in charge. But if you have divided government, you can give credit to one party and give blame to the other. As we mentioned before, provide social services, not really a role of government today. There were times in which it clearly was an important part of government, and that's reflected in the movie Gangs of New York. It's portrayed that way, very interesting and a good movie to watch to get that storyline, how political parties would reward candidates, how they would provide social services, even things such as fire control. And you would usually have a boss that would run the local party machine and would give out favors and benefits to people, even things such as jobs, food, places to stay, those kinds of benefits. And one of the last bosses would be Richard Daley. We see a picture of him here on the left, and he was mayor of Chicago up until the 1970s and was known to be the boss of Chicago. But that system is really not used today. There are third parties. There are two major third parties. So again, your text goes into considerable detail about the Democrat and Republican parties, as the text should. They're the two oldest and most effective political parties. But there are third parties. So this is the Green Party, which focuses on environmental issues. Jill Stein was its most recent candidate for president. It was on the ballot in many of the states, was not on the ballot here in Oklahoma. There is also the Libertarian Party, and this is the most established of the third parties, and this third party was on the ballot in every state, so it was on the ballot in Oklahoma. This is a political party that wants to reduce the size, certainly of the national government, but the size of government overall. And this was its candidate in 2016, Gary Johnson, a former governor, Republican governor of New Mexico. Spend some time considering why third parties fail and some of the reasons here. It's really not highlighted in your text, so I have that in italics. Keep that in mind. Some of the reasons why third parties fail: they're too dependent on a single leader. Ross Perot, and you'll read about him in your text, was a very effective third-party leader in 1992. But once he got out of politics, his political party started to collapse, and that generally is the case. And you'll see that with other third parties in there. One of the best examples in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1912 election, for example, you had former President Teddy Roosevelt running on the Bull Moose Party ticket, third party. And once Roosevelt got out of politics, the Bull Moose Party collapsed. Two, regional. This is a symbol of the Populist Party that in the late 1800s was very popular in the South and the West, wanting to get away from the gold standard and to start to use silver as well to back paper money. And so the idea would be more money would be in the system and would help people on the lower end of the economic spectrum. While this was a very popular party in some parts of the country, there were other parts where it was not very popular, and so it just could not get a national following. Too fixated on a few issues. During Prohibition, for example, there was a political party called the Light Wine and Beer Party, and that might be an important issue to some people, but not to enough, and they really couldn't expand into other issues that might be worthwhile. Too radical. People have multiple reasons why they vote or support a political party. Generally, they're not supporting a political party that wants to completely overthrow the system that you currently have. You want to make some tweaks to it, make some changes, maybe eliminate some parts, but to have a system in which whole groups of people are considered inferior and should be punished in some ways as a result, not recognized as citizens, perhaps not even recognized as humans, as we see with the National Socialist Party. Thankfully, most people are not willing to support that. Or the Communist Party, that would look at any form of private enterprise as illegal and eventually get to that point and take away people's private property. That again, thankfully, most people don't view that as a good route to go. Probably more than anything else, the reason why third parties are not successful in the United States is the voting system. As we've talked about before, the single district simple plurality system tends to benefit the two major parties, and that goes back to Duverger's law way of considering that. If you have that system, the first past the post or winner take all system, it's going to help the two major competitive parties, and that does tend to be the case. And again, as I mentioned, perhaps you can add on to that the Electoral College, which helps to explain why then these two parties that we have right now and why the two-party system itself has been so successful in the United States. Some court cases to remember about political parties. And generally, the idea is that political parties cannot be private clubs. They have to be open to the public. So you can see that with Smith and Allwright. And increasingly, you can't use political parties as a reason to benefit one person over another when it comes to seeking a job. Now, there is a different way of allowing votes to be counted. And if you go the route of proportional representation, as countries have done, you tend to then get more than two political parties. In fact, it's a pretty safe bet to say that if you want more than two political parties, the quickest way for that to happen is to adopt proportional representation. So here we can see an outcome a few years back now in a country that uses proportional representation in Germany. And as you can see here, you have 5 competitive political parties. Usually you would have a threshold, perhaps a threshold saying 5%. So a political party has to get at least 5% if it wants to have some representation. And perhaps you could raise that even higher. Notice if you, let's say you had the threshold at 20%, then 3 of these political parties would be eliminated unless they were able to shift their votes around. And so that's partly how proportional representation can actually reduce the number of third parties as well. But if you have a low threshold, you tend to have more than 2 political parties, as we can see here in the case of Germany. And so Angela Merkel, who is still the Chancellor of Germany, would need, and she's from the Christian Democrat Party, she would need to then reach out to other political parties to get a majority for her to be elected to serve as Chancellor. And so that's a trade-off for this type of system. You do have to get political parties, almost always, they're not going to get enough to have a majority. So you're going to have to go with other political parties to have a coalition to govern. And there's a difference, though, in how you use these two systems. Germany actually does use one section of single district simple plurality, and that is selecting a candidate. Then when it comes to choosing a party, you have proportional representation. So there's no doubt that there's a distortion of the overall vote in the two-party system. It can exaggerate the votes of the majority party. So just consider, for example, are of major parties. So the Republicans in 2014 overall got 47% of the vote, but the way districts were drawn, they actually got 54% of the representation. And so it also, because you had third parties getting at least a few percentages of the votes, but not enough to win outright, that's how you have this distortion. So that's one of the common outcomes to a two-party and a first-past-the-post system. So do keep in mind about the party system, and that we have seen some changes in the contemporary American party system. It does make us wonder what the year 2020 will be like. Will it be ushering in an era of one party being the dominant political party, or will we continue to see divided government? And you can read about that in these pages overall, roughly from 360 to 365. And then you can see also some questions there about the contemporary American party system. All right, we will now shift our attention to Chapter 10, Campaigns and Elections.